The day Marisol Vega arrived at Bridger Falls Regional Medical Center, the sky over Montana was the color of old pewter, and the Rockies to the west looked like they had been pressed into the horizon by something enormous and indifferent. She drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a pine tree air freshener that had long since lost its scent. On the passenger seat, a laminated photograph of her mother, Rosa Vega, faced upward toward the ceiling, as if watching for something Marisol could not yet see. She had been driving for 11 hours straight from Boise, where she had completed her nursing degree at the age of 29. Older than most of her classmates, slower than none of them. The acceptance letter from Bridger Falls had arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks after her mother's funeral. She had taken that as a sign, though she couldn't have told anyone what kind of sign it was, permission or punishment, or perhaps simply the world's blunt insistence that life continues regardless. She parked in the staff lot, checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. Her scrubs were a clean slate blue. Her sneakers were white and new. She looked, she thought, exactly like someone pretending not to be terrified. "You the new hire?" The woman at the nursing station didn't look up from her computer screen. Her name badge read, Donna Keller, RN, Charge Nurse, and her tone carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has seen too many new hires come and go to invest in the ceremony of hello. "Yes, Marisol Vega. I'm starting on the medical surgical floor." Donna glanced up then, a brief clinical assessment, the kind usually reserved for patients, and said, "Locker room's down the hall. Don't use locker 14, that's Patrice's." She returned to her screen. Marisol found her locker. She did not use number 14. What followed were 3 weeks of careful, deliberate invisibility. She arrived early, left late, charted meticulously, and spoke only when spoken to. She was good at the work, genuinely, naturally good at it, the way some people are good at listening to engines or reading weather. She caught a medication dosage error on her second day that could have sent a 63-year-old man with compromised kidneys into acute failure. She said nothing about it to anyone except the attending physician, who corrected the order and did not thank her. She hadn't expected him to. The staff, for their part, treated her with the particular cruelty of people who have decided, without evidence, that someone does not belong. It was not theatrical. It was architectural, built into the structure of every shift. In the break room, conversations would simply close when she entered, like flowers shutting at dusk. During handoff rounds, her observations were acknowledged with the faintest nods, the kind given to things overheard rather than said. There was a shared assumption among the senior nurses, Patrice, Donna, a travel nurse named Greg, who had been there long enough to have opinions, that Marisol had gotten the position through some administrative miscalculation. She had no connections in Montana. She had no history here. She had appeared fully formed from somewhere south and elsewhere, and that was somehow suspicious. "She's quiet because she doesn't know what she's doing," Greg said one Tuesday evening, loud enough that Marisol, charting 4 feet away, could hear every word. "Quiet nurses are either brilliant or dangerous." "I haven't seen the brilliant part yet." Patrice laughed. Not cruelly. Worse than that. Casually. Marisol did not look up from her chart. What they did not know, what she had told no one, was that the silence was not weakness. It was excavated space. A place she had made inside herself after her mother died, hollowed out by grief the way a river hollows stone. Slowly, inevitably, and with great force. Rosa Vega had spent 41 years cleaning other people's houses in Phoenix, Arizona, and she had died of a pulmonary embolism that a different doctor, in a different zip code, with a different insurance plan might have caught in time. Marisol had been in her second year of nursing school when it happened. She had understood with terrible clarity exactly what had gone wrong and exactly why. She had become a nurse because of that knowledge, not to honor her mother. That would have been too clean, too cinematic. She had become a nurse because the alternative was to do nothing with what she knew, and she could not bear that. There was one person at Bridger Falls who did not seem to share the prevailing opinion of Marisol Vega. His name was Harold Okafor, and he was 71 years old. And he had been admitted 2 days after her arrival with a diagnosis of congestive heart failure, complicated by the fact that he was an extraordinarily difficult patient who refused to cooperate with anyone wearing a white coat. "I don't like doctors," he announced on Marisol's first visit to his room, before she had said a single word. He was a large man, diminished by illness, but not by character. with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that moved like they were reading text printed just behind your face. "I'm not a doctor," Marisol said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he agreed, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Sit down." She sat. Over the following days, during the quiet hours when the ward slowed and the mountain dark pressed against the windows, Harold Okafor talked, and Marisol listened. He had been a merchant marine. He had worked fishing boats off the Oregon coast. He had, in a previous chapter of his life that he described with the offhand precision of someone reading from a manual, served as a combat medic in a war he did not name. He had seen things, he said, that rearranged the furniture of a person, that made certain rooms in you impossible to go back to. "You've got that look," he told her one evening, when the sky outside had gone the deep purple of a bruise. "What look?" "Like someone who has been somewhere they can't explain to people who haven't been there." He paused. "Grief," he added, "or something close enough that the difference doesn't matter." Marisol said nothing. She adjusted the drip rate on his IV with the same precision she brought to everything. "You're going to be tested," Harold said, closing his eyes. "Not by any of these people." He gestured vaguely at the hall, at the ward, at the accumulated judgment of Bridger Falls Regional Medical Center. "By something bigger, and you'll pass. I can always tell." She thought he was drifting into sleep, and the strange, loose philosophizing that sometimes came with fatigue and medication. She smiled faintly and moved to leave. "Marisol," he said, without opening his eyes. She stopped. "When it happens, don't ask for permission." She carried those words out of the room with her and said nothing about them to anyone. 3 days later, Harold Okafor was transferred to a cardiology unit in Billings, and she never saw him again. She did not forget what he said. The transfer order came on a Wednesday in November, when the first real snow of the season had begun to fall across the high plains, and the parking lot of Bridger Falls Regional looked like a photograph slowly developing into something white and erased. Marisol had been reassigned, temporarily the paperwork said, to St. Augustine Medical Center in Casper, Wyoming, as part of an inter-facility staffing agreement. She was given 4 hours' notice. She packed her car that evening and drove south through the dark, the headlights cutting tunnels through the falling snow, the pine tree air freshener swaying gently from the mirror. St. Augustine was a larger facility, a Level 2 trauma center with a cardiac ICU, a surgical floor, and a helipad on the East Wing's roof that was used, on average, twice a month for medical evacuations. The staff here was different in texture but recognizable in type, competent, tribal, and mildly suspicious of anyone who arrived without history. Her first week passed in the way of all new beginnings, careful, provisional, calibrated. She worked the night shift in the cardiac ICU, where the patients were often the most critical, and the work was precise in a way she found clarifying. Sleep deprivation sharpened rather than dulled her. The quiet of 3 a.m., in an ICU, the measured beeping of monitors, the soft percussion of ventilators, the occasional murmured exchange between staff, suited something in her that daylight hours could not reach. It was on her 9th night that it happened. The call came from the nursing supervisor at 2:47 a.m., a voice that was professionally calm in the way that professionals are calm when the alternative is panic. "We have an incoming VIP patient classified Navy. ETA 18 minutes. Requesting your ICU team to full prep. Bay 3. Trauma protocol. Cardiac involvement suspected. I need your best hands on this." Marisol was already moving before the supervisor finished speaking. What nobody at St. Augustine knew, what she had told no one, here or at Bridger Falls, because it was not the kind of thing that came up in conversation, and because she did not volunteer information about herself to people who had not extended the courtesy of genuine curiosity, was that before nursing school, before Phoenix, before the long, grief-filled years of her mother's decline, Marisol Vega had spent 14 months embedded with a civilian medical response team operating alongside U.S. Special Operations Forces in 3 separate undisclosed locations. She had gone at 23, recruited through a humanitarian organization by a former combat surgeon who had seen her work during a medical mission in Oaxaca and told her, with the directness of someone who did not have time for pleasantries, that she had the rarest possible combination of instincts. She was both technical and calm. She had treated blast injuries in conditions that would have been, to the staff of St. Augustine Medical Center, entirely unimaginable. She had performed emergency interventions in tents, in vehicles, in the dark. She had kept people alive using improvised equipment and the absolute refusal to accept the alternative. She had come home changed in ways she could not articulate to anyone who had not been there. She had enrolled in nursing school. She had taken care of her mother. And she had never, not once, mentioned any of it to a single colleague in her professional life because she did not consider her past a credential. It was simply experience. The way stone that has been under pressure for long enough becomes something harder than it began as. She was gloved and gowned and standing at the Bay 3 entrance when the helicopter landed. It was a Navy MH-60 Sierra, a medevac variant, military spec, and the sight of it settling onto the St. Augustine helipad, with its running lights cutting through the snowfall, was the kind of image that makes even experienced medical professionals pause for just a moment before resuming the work of not pausing. The patient was Rear Admiral James Whitfield, 64 years old, classified transport for reasons that had not been explained to the civilian medical team and did not need to be. What mattered was this. He had presented with acute decompensated heart failure, complicated by a suspected aortic dissection, and he was deteriorating faster than the Navy's own flight surgeon, a young lieutenant named Reyes, had anticipated during transport. Lieutenant Reyes came through the door 2 steps ahead of the gurney, his face tight with controlled urgency, his eyes scanning the assembled team with rapid, practiced assessment. He found Marisol at the center of the bay, and what he said to her, in the military shorthand of people accustomed to handing off critical patients across institutional lines, she answered with the same shorthand. She answered it fluently. Reyes stopped, just for a half second, the way a person stops when they expected to find a door and find instead an opening. "You have experience with this presentation," he said. It was not a question. "Enough," she said. He nodded once and stepped aside. What followed was 38 minutes of the most concentrated clinical work the staff of St. Augustine's cardiac ICU had witnessed. It was not dramatic in the way that emergency medicine appears dramatic on screens. It was quiet and dense with decision, the way that very serious things often are. Marisol moved through the bay with the economy of someone who has worked in places where there was no margin for wasted motion, calling for interventions in the correct sequence, reading the monitor data with a speed that was not showy but was impossible not to notice, adjusting the vasopressor drip with a precision that made the attending cardiologist, Dr. Priya Anand, look up from the echocardiogram and take note of the nurse across the bed from her with an expression that contained, in its depths, something like reassessment. At the 38th minute, Rear Admiral Whitfield's pressure stabilized. At the 40th minute, the crisis passed. The bay went, not silent exactly, but still, the particular stillness that follows the cessation of something that required everything you had. Marisol stripped off her outer glove, checked the drip rate one final time, and turned to find that every person in Bay 3 was looking at her. Not at the monitor, not at the patient, at her. She did not return the looks. She turned to Lieutenant Reyes, who was standing near the door in the posture of someone who has just witnessed something they were not entirely prepared for, and she said, "He'll need the CT angio within the hour. Dr. Anand has the imaging order." "I'll watch him until then," Reyes said. "Where did you—" "I'll watch him," she said again, quietly. And Reyes, who was a military man and understood that some questions are not asked of some people, nodded and made no further inquiry. 3 weeks after the night of the helicopter, Marisol Vega received a transfer offer she had not requested. A permanent position at the University of Colorado Hospital in Aurora, attached to the cardiac surgery unit, with a salary that represented a meaningful recalibration of what her labor was worth. The offer came through official channels. It bore in the remarks field a single handwritten line that had been faxed and refaxed until it was slightly blurred. Recommended without reservation. J. Whitfield, RADM, USN, pending. She read it twice. She set it on the kitchen table of the furnished room she was renting in Casper. Outside, the Wyoming winter was in its full, indifferent authority, and the sky was the particular grey of pewter that she had come to associate now with the beginning of things. She thought about Harold Okafor, who had told her she would be tested and had known she would pass. She thought about her mother, Rosa, who had cleaned other people's houses for 41 years with the understanding, not articulated but deeply held, that her daughter would someday enter rooms as something other than a person who cleaned them. She thought about the staff at Bridger Falls, Greg and his casual cruelty, Patrice's casual laughter, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she felt nothing particularly sharp about them. Not forgiveness, which would have required making them more significant than they were. Not anger, which would have required the same. Just the cool, clear recognition that small people occupy small rooms, and she was no longer in that building. She accepted the offer. Aurora, Colorado, sits on the eastern edge of the Denver metropolitan area, where the plains begin their long, flat argument with the horizon before the Rockies interrupt from the west. The University of Colorado Hospital was a different world from Bridger Falls. Vast, academic, fluorescent, and populated by people whose relationship to medicine was so specialized that whole floors might pass without anyone caring about your origins. Marisol, who had spent her professional life learning to be invisible, discovered here that invisibility was not required. The department had no interest in her biography, only in her competence, and her competence was, as it had always been, beyond dispute. She was 3 months into the position when she got the call from Lieutenant Reyes. He was out of uniform now. Retired, she gathered from context, at 38, with the particular clarity of a man who had decided to redirect his life with military decisiveness. He was pursuing a physician assistant degree at a school in Denver. He was calling, he said, because Admiral Whitfield wanted to speak with her. He's recovering well, Reyes added. He's specific about things. He asked me to find you. You found me. I work with Navy, he said, and she heard something in the cadence that was not boastfulness, but simple statement of capability. Can I give him your number? Yes, she said. The Admiral called 2 days later, on a Saturday morning when Aurora was under a thin February sun and the mountains to the west were white and enormous and still. He had a voice that had been through things and come out the other side with its authority intact. He thanked her with the directness of a man who does not use thank yous as social lubricant. He told her that his surgeons had confirmed, based on the imaging she had ordered and the stabilization she had achieved in those 38 minutes, that her interventions had almost certainly prevented a dissection that would have been fatal given the transport timeline. I want to know, he said, where you trained, not for school. Before that, the silence that followed was brief and for Marisol familiar. It doesn't matter, she said. It does to me. Why? Another pause. His this time. Because I've been in medicine for 30 years, Admiral level, and I've seen the way people move when they've worked in hard places. You moved like that, and nobody knew it about you. That's either humility or habit, and I'd like to know which. Marisol looked at the mountains through her window. They were the same mountains she had driven toward on that first gray morning in Montana, pressing themselves against the horizon with their ancient, unconvinced permanence. Both, she said. He laughed, a short, genuine sound. Fair enough. I have a question for you. Off the record. All right. The nurses at that hospital in Casper, after. Did anyone say anything to you? Any of them? She knew what he was asking, knew he had been made aware, in the way that people of his position are made aware of things, of the texture of how she had been received in those settings. Word travels in medicine, especially when a Navy Rear Admiral stabilizes in a civilian ICU against expectations. No, she said. No one said anything. And that was true. That was, in fact, the entire story of what happened after the helicopter landed and the crisis passed, and the stillness settled over Bay 3 like snow settling over the high plains at night. No one had apologized. No one had pulled her aside with a reddened face and a rearranged opinion. Patrice and Greg were in another state and another building, and she suspected that they had continued to be exactly who they were because people generally do. But at St. Augustine, in the days that followed, before the transfer offer arrived, there had been a different kind of silence. Not the silence of dismissal, which she knew well by now, but the silence of people recalibrating, of staff who had categorized her one way, finding themselves unable to locate the filing system they had used. It was not apology. It was not even acknowledgement exactly. It was the silence of the found out, and it was complete, and it was enough. She had not required more than that. She had learned, from her mother, and from the places she had been, and from the long private labor of grief, that the world does not owe you its revised opinion in spoken form. Sometimes it simply stops talking in a certain way, and that silence has to be sufficient. Nobody said anything, she repeated to the Admiral. He said. And then, good. She didn't ask him to explain that. She thought she understood it. After she hung up, she stood at the window for a long time. The sun had moved west, and the Rockies were backlit now, dark and absolute and present in the way of things that have been standing longer than any of the arguments happening at their feet. She was 30 years old. She was, for the first time in what felt like a very long while, exactly where she was supposed to be. The world turns. Never humiliate others. Today you rise, tomorrow you may fall. Show kindness, choose humility, and respect every person. Life changes quickly, and how you treat others will return to you.